Weston Hale only meant to return the phone he found on the hangar floor. But when the screen lit up in his palm, the single father went completely still. Staring back at him was a photograph of himself at 17, wearing his old school jacket, standing beside the silver glider he had built alongside a girl who vanished the morning after graduation. The phone belonged to Vivienne Ashcroft, the powerful CEO whose private jet had just made an unscheduled landing at his airport. 22 years had passed since she left without a single word of goodbye, and now she was looking straight at him, asking the question that stopped every thought in his head. Did you never receive any of my letters? Stay until the very end to find out who tore them apart and why that photograph had never once been deleted. The evening shift at Lakehurst Regional Airport began like most others. Quiet runways, instrument checks, the particular hum of ground support equipment moving in the blue-gray light of a Michigan dusk. Weston Hale was 40 years old, methodical by temperament and immovable by habit, and he had spent the better part of the last 12 years in hangars like this one, reading the language that machines speak when something is about to go wrong. He had been assigned to assist with ground power verification for an Ashcroft Aeronautics test aircraft that had diverted from its scheduled flight path, nothing in the briefing suggesting the night would become anything other than a long shift with overtime paperwork. He was working alone near the far end of the hangar, tracing a voltage irregularity in a secondary junction panel, when his boot caught the edge of something on the polished concrete. A slim, brushed titanium phone, tucked half under the low bench reserved for visiting technical delegations. He picked it up automatically, intending to carry it to the operations desk, and the screen pulsed to life as he turned it over in his hand. What he saw on that lock screen made the breath leave his body as if he had walked into an airframe at full pressure. A boy of 17 stood beside a glider with a 2-meter wingspan and silver laminate wings, the kind of construction that could only have been built by someone who genuinely cared whether the numbers held under load. The boy's jacket read Lakehurst High across the chest. His expression was the quiet pride of someone who had just heard his name announced over a state competition loudspeaker. Weston knew the photograph because he had been standing inside it on the day it was taken. At the regional science fair during the last spring, he had believed anything about his future was certain. The original image had held two figures. He and the girl beside him had built that glider together, her on the mathematics and aerodynamic modeling, him on the physical assembly and balance systems. But the lock screen had been cropped so that only his half remained. He stood there with a dead man's stillness, still holding the phone, while the implications of what he was looking at arranged themselves into a sentence he could not yet bring himself to finish. He did not hear the security team coming back down the corridor until one of them addressed him by name and asked him to return the device belonging to Ms. Ashcroft. Vivienne Ashcroft came around the corner of the hangar 30 seconds later, and she recognized him before he had fully registered who she was. Her face went through several things in rapid sequence: recognition, a sharp intake of breath barely visible, and then a very controlled stillness that Weston understood as a person accustomed to being watched, choosing not to show everything at once. She was dressed for a board-level meeting rather than a hangar floor, and she carried herself with the particular composure of someone who had spent 2 decades being the most powerful person in every room she entered. He handed the phone back without a word. She looked at his expression and understood with perfect clarity that he had seen what was on the screen. The security team withdrew at a quiet gesture from Vivienne, and the two of them stood in the ambient noise of the hangar while 22 years tried to compress themselves into the space of a single moment. She asked the only question that mattered, and he told her the truth. He had waited a full year, checking the mail every day, writing letters that were returned or went unanswered, and finally receiving a short note that he had interpreted as the end of everything between them. Vivian absorbed this without expression. Then she said she had sent him 37 letters. To understand why that number felt like a physical blow, it was necessary to go back to the year that had built both of them and then taken itself apart. Vivian had arrived in Lakehurst during the fall semester of their senior year, when Thaddeus Ashcroft had opened a short-term research facility 40 minutes outside of town and moved his family temporarily into a lakeside house that was more square footage than the entire science building at Lakehurst High. She walked into the school carrying the polished silence of someone who had grown up understanding that wealth created distance, and most of her classmates confirmed that expectation by maintaining it. Weston had not done that. He sat beside her in the science elective not because he was unaware of who her father was, but because he was genuinely more interested in her answer to the problem on the board, and she had noticed the difference. They began working together informally, then officially through the science club, and the glider project emerged from a conversation about whether a passive balance control system could compensate for variable wind shear without any active motor input. Vivian handled the aerodynamics and the load calculations with a precision that made Weston re-examine his own work every time she handed back a marked-up draft. He handled the physical construction and the mechanical balance rig, translating her equations into something that could be held and tested and adjusted. The collaboration deepened into friendship over 4 months of Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings in the school workshop, and then deepened further into something neither of them had a practiced vocabulary for, because it was the first time for both of them. They won the state competition in April. The photograph was taken that day, both of them standing beside the glider with the kind of straightforward happiness that belongs entirely to people who have not yet learned what it costs. By May, they had begun quietly discussing which engineering programs at public universities offered combined enrollment pathways, and by the time graduation week arrived, the future they imagined together felt more solid than the one their separate families had planned. The night before the ceremony, Vivian told him that her family intended to take her to London for the summer and possibly longer, that her father had been negotiating a European expansion of the aeronautics division, and that she was going to fight to come back. She would write him the moment she had a stable address. She asked him to wait. 3 days after graduation, the Ashcroft household left Lakehurst without ceremony and without any opportunity for Vivian to see Weston one final time. He wrote to the London address she had given him and received no response. He wrote again and again through the summer and into the following fall. Then a letter arrived, short, clean, signed with Vivian's name, saying that the feelings they had shared were an adolescent impulse, and that she had chosen not to continue the correspondence. Weston read it once, folded it, and put it in a drawer where it remained for 22 years. He did not cry, because he was 18 and had learned early that certain kinds of pain did not announce themselves dramatically. They simply moved in and rearranged the furniture of who you were. He enrolled in aviation technical training, built a career at Lakehurst Regional, married Lauren, a quiet woman with a dry sense of humor and a very precise understanding of what she wanted from her life, and they raised a daughter together in the house his parents had left him. Lauren died 4 years ago, 1 year after the diagnosis, and the grief of that loss was real and permanent and not reducible to any comparison with anything that had come before. Vivian's letter was still in the drawer. He had never thought to show it to anyone. But on the other side of the Atlantic, a girl becoming a woman had received a similar letter bearing his name, and she too had folded it away and told herself she understood what it meant. Vivian suggested a private conversation in the airport's executive lounge, away from the technical staff, and Weston agreed with the caveat that he needed 15 minutes to finish the equipment log. When they sat across from each other in the empty lounge, the first thing he did was establish the context he felt she deserved to have. He had been married, he said, to a woman he had loved and who had died, and he was raising their daughter alone, and he was not going to let this conversation become something that erased any of that. Vivian heard it not as a warning but as the measure of who he had become, a man who did not trade in sentimentality, who respected the people who had been real in his life, and who was not going to perform grief to satisfy anyone's expectations. She said she understood. She did not attempt to reframe the night as a reunion. She explained the photograph calmly. It was a digital scan of the only physical image she had retained from that year, taken from her mother's storage before the older woman moved to a smaller apartment, and the crop on the lock screen was an accident of the phone's display geometry. The full image included her, standing on his left, but the clock widget covered that half of the frame. She had never changed it. She offered this information without defensiveness, which told him more than any explanation would have. She had not married. There had been a brief engagement to someone her family approved of, a man from an acceptable background with appropriate connections, but she had ended it within 8 months when she understood that his interest was entirely in the Ashcroft balance sheet. She had built the company, expanded the commercial division, pushed the Aurelian program past 3 board vetoes, and done it while being the only Ashcroft who had ever actually studied aeronautical engineering rather than simply inheriting the nameplate. Weston asked why she had never found him through public records or professional directories, and she answered with the kind of honesty that costs something. She had found him years ago, seen that he was married with a child, and made the deliberate choice not to introduce any disruption into a life that appeared complete. She had considered this a decision made out of respect. He considered it now, quietly, and did not argue with the logic of it, even though something about it made the distance between them feel very precisely calculated. They did not have time to go further, because Blaine Carrington came through the lounge door with the practiced confidence of a man who considered himself entitled to every room he entered, glanced between them with a single assessment, and asked in a tone calibrated to condescend why a ground technician was occupying a restricted lounge with the company's chief executive. Vivian introduced Weston as an old friend from before her career. Blaine said the name very carefully, as though testing its weight, and then smiled with the part of his face that had nothing to do with actual pleasure, made a brief excuse, and left. In the corridor outside, his phone was already at his ear, and he gave the instruction in a low voice that a certain sealed family file, the one from the summer after Vivian Ashcroft's graduation year, needed to be located and reviewed immediately. The Ashcroft Aurelian X had diverted to Lakehurst because its autopilot was generating a continuous false pitch warning, telling the flight management computer that the aircraft was rolling when the attitude indicators showed it was level. The internal engineering team had reviewed the sensor data and concluded the anomaly was interference from a nearby weather system, a credible explanation and, as it turned out, a wrong one. Blaine had been pressing for the aircraft to return to the test schedule within 24 hours because a demonstration flight was scheduled for a consortium of defense procurement officers whose interest in the program had been difficult to secure and would not survive another postponement. The internal team had signed off on the return-to-service document, and Blaine had already sent the updated flight plan to the visiting delegation when Weston, running a routine ground power continuity check, noticed something in the electrical load patterns that the main diagnostic software had not flagged. The pitch error only appeared during windows when both the anti-ice system and the flight data transmitter were drawing power simultaneously. Alone, each system tested clean. Together, they produced a voltage ripple below the alarm threshold, but sufficient to feed the inertial reference unit a fractionally incorrect signal. He brought this to Tobias Wren, Ashcroft's chief of engineering, a man with 57 years of patience and the deep, undemonstrative expertise that had kept the company technically credible through 4 different CEO transitions. Tobias listened to Weston's analysis with the specific quality of attention that only engineers who have been wrong about something serious ever develop. Blaine, who had arrived in the maintenance bay to push for departure clearance, made a remark sharp enough to make 2 junior technicians go very still. Something about local ground crew offering remedial instruction to the people who had actually designed the aircraft. Vivian was there, and she asked Tobias to run the interaction test. The results confirmed everything Weston had described. A secondary distribution module was generating micro-oscillations under the dual-load condition, and the cumulative effect over a long flight in icing conditions could force the flight crew to disengage the autopilot at a critical phase of approach. It was not a catastrophic failure mode. It was the kind of failure mode that contributed entries to accident investigation reports. Vivian suspended the demonstration flight and accepted the contractual consequences. Tobias, who had watched Weston trace an interactive fault that his own team had systematically missed, asked whether Weston would consider taking a short-term independent verification contract. Reporting through the engineering office, not through the executive suite, to keep the arrangement at arm's length from any personal consideration. Weston agreed to those terms and added one of his own. Every finding he produced would go to Tobias first, in writing, before any communication with Vivian, precisely so that no one could later argue the work had been shaped by anything other than the data. It was a structurally sound arrangement. What neither man had noticed yet was that the distribution module generating the fault had a supplier designation that traced directly to a sourcing recommendation. Blaine Carrington had introduced into the procurement chain 14 months earlier. The Aurelian X remained grounded for inspection, and over the following 10 days Weston and Vivian found themselves in proximity more often than the professional arrangement strictly required. Not because either of them sought it, but because a serious airworthiness investigation on a small airfield creates a compressed geography in which the relevant people repeatedly encounter each other at coffee machines and corridor intersections. They were careful and they were honest about being careful, which was its own kind of progress. Vivian brought him several pages photographed from letters she had written during the first year after London, digital scans recovered from a draft folder in her mother's archived email, letters that had never been sent electronically, but that she had typed as backups before mailing the handwritten versions. Reading them, Weston experienced the particular vertigo of encountering a past that had existed in full and parallel to the version he had lived. The letters described a girl navigating a city where she knew no one who spoke to her as though she were a person rather than an inheritance, calculating the months until she would be old enough to take a flight back to Michigan without asking permission, describing the London autumn as beautiful and completely irrelevant to anything she actually cared about. He showed her the letter he had kept. She read it standing at the window of the hangar office, holding it with 2 hands as though the paper required steadying, and when she finished, she said only that she had never written those sentences. They compared the signature, her name written in the careful cursive she had learned at 9, with the particular loop on the capital V that she had never been able to break, against the signature on his letter. The loops were present but mechanical, the way a signature looks when someone has studied it carefully enough to approximate the shape but has never inhabited the motion. Neither of them made the accusation aloud. Weston said he wanted documented evidence before any name was attached to the conclusion. because turning private pain into public accusation without proof was a way of making yourself into exactly the kind of person he had spent his adult life refusing to become. Marin Caldwell, the company's legal compliance director, began an audit of the historical correspondence records held in the Ashcroft family's retained legal archive. What she found was that every piece of mail processed during a 14-month window surrounding Vivienne's first year abroad had passed through the offices of Carrington Legal under a family services retainer, with Blaine, 19 years old, working a summer position at his father's firm, listed as secondary correspondence coordinator. June arrived at the airport one afternoon to give her father a document he had left at home, and she encountered Vivienne briefly in the operations hallway. Vivienne did not attempt to be charming or to make herself appealing to a 16-year-old girl whose instincts were almost certainly already calibrated to distinguish between people who wanted something and people who were simply present. She said she was an old friend of Weston's from before his career, and she asked June what she was studying in school. June said astronomy and photography, and Vivienne said those were two disciplines that rewarded the same fundamental skill, knowing exactly where to point your attention. June went home and mentioned to her father, with the careful neutrality of a teenager who had decided not to editorialize, that his friend seemed like someone who gave answers instead of performances. That same evening, Weston found the old photograph of the glider in the family memory box on the hallway shelf, a physical print, slightly faded at the edges, with both figures intact. Himself and Vivienne, the full image, neither of them cropped out of each other's story. He turned it over. On the back, in handwriting he barely recognized as his own younger self's, were the words, "Wherever you are, I'll still be waiting for an answer." The scandal arrived in the form of a photograph and a headline. Someone had passed an image to a financial news service, Weston and Vivienne in conversation inside the hangar, taken at an angle that removed all the professional context and left only the intimate geometry of two people standing close together in a space full of expensive machinery. The story that accompanied it characterized the situation as a chief executive, having introduced a former teenage boyfriend into a multi-billion-dollar safety-critical program, bypassing competitive procurement, and suggested that every technical finding produced under the arrangement deserved to be reviewed for objectivity. Blaine presented the coverage to the board with the practiced gravity of a man who had not written the story himself, but was profoundly concerned by what it revealed. He moved for a suspension of Weston's contract and an independent review of the conflict of interest framework. Vivienne documented the procurement record in detail. Tobias had initiated the engagement. The fee structure had been approved by an independent compliance officer, and she had not participated in a single negotiation session. The board received this without enthusiasm, because the story was not really about procurement compliance, and everyone in the room understood that. Then Blaine introduced the heavier charge. He noted that Weston had been alone with Vivienne's phone for approximately 10 minutes before returning it, and suggested, with the measured insinuation of someone who had been practicing the sentence for days, that a technically skilled individual with access to a device for that duration might be able to extract calendar data, communications, or proprietary product documentation, and that a gifted technician who arrived at precisely the right diagnostic conclusions might have had reasons for his insight that did not originate in the data logs. Weston was placed on administrative hold, removed from the hangar floor, and asked to surrender his company-issued access credentials while a digital forensics review was conducted. He complied without argument and requested that every step of the process be recorded on camera, not because he expected fair treatment, but because documentation was a principle he applied to everything that mattered, and he saw no reason to stop now. The forensics review found what it found. The phone had never been unlocked during the period in question, its biometric lock had not been bypassed, and the only information accessible from its screen in that state was whatever appeared on the lock display. Blaine did not withdraw the insinuation. He redirected it, pivoting to the tabloid framing, a single father of modest means, a billionaire CEO, a 22-year gap, and allowed the implication to do the work that the evidence refused to do. Weston, reading the coverage from his suspended status, asked through Marin whether he could speak directly to Vivienne. She came to the regional terminal's empty departure lounge on a Tuesday afternoon, and he told her he was prepared to remove himself from the situation entirely if she believed that was the right outcome for the company and for herself. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he did not immediately have a response to. If he was leaving because he had genuinely lost confidence in the process, she would respect that without argument. But if he was leaving because Blaine had written a story about him, and he had decided the story was easier to walk away from than to stand against, then the man who left this room would be handing Blaine the same victory that the boy had handed him 22 years ago, and she would like him to think carefully about whether that was who he intended to be. He thought about it. He stayed. 3 days later, a second non-conforming module was discovered on the Aurelian X, installed during the window of Weston's suspension, in a component bay that only authorized engineering personnel could access. The second module carried valid-looking certification markings and a legitimate serial number. But when Tobias disassembled it, the internal architecture did not match the approved design documentation. Someone was inserting counterfeit components that were engineered to fail gradually. Not catastrophically, not in a way that would produce an accident on a demonstration flight, but in a way that would produce a series of unexplained anomalies, delay the airworthiness certification by months, and give a buyer with access to inside information precisely the kind of leverage needed to acquire the program at distressed pricing. Tobias and Weston worked quietly for 6 days, mapping the component substitution timeline against the internal communication logs, using a tracking system they had constructed without notifying the broader management chain. The pattern was exact and damning. Every substitution had occurred within 48 hours of an engineering status report being routed to Blaine Carrington's office. The coincidence was not a coincidence. It was a supply chain attack executed by someone who understood the program's architecture well enough to know which components could be degraded without triggering an immediate grounding, and who had access to a parallel procurement channel. Blaine had been positioning the board for months. His formal proposal, structured as a rescue operation, complete with financial modeling prepared by a firm with undisclosed connections to Preston Lockwood's holding company, called for a sale of the Aurelian program to Lockwood Meridian Aviation at a valuation that reflected the safety concerns and certification delays, rather than the program's actual technical merit. Preston had presented himself publicly as an interested acquirer responding to a distressed asset. What was not public was the side agreement in which Blaine would receive an executive appointment at Lockwood Meridian and a carried interest in the acquired program the moment the transaction closed. The two of them had understood for well over a year that the path to the acquisition ran through manufactured crisis, and they had been manufacturing it with considerable patience. Meanwhile, something quieter was happening between Weston and Vivienne, not a restoration of what they had been at 17, because those two people were gone and neither of them was foolish enough to pretend otherwise, but a slow, honest reconstruction of the trust that had been broken by someone else's decision, tested against the people they had actually become. They agreed, without making it into a formal declaration, that nothing between them would move forward while the investigation was active. Vivian said she did not want Weston to ever be described as someone she had rewarded. He said he did not want his daughter to think he was trying to relive a chapter that belonged to a version of himself she had never met. Thaddeus Ashcroft contacted Weston directly during this period, through a formal letter delivered to the Lakehurst Regional Operations Office. The letter was courteous and entirely clear in its intent. Thaddeus acknowledged that Weston had displayed genuine competence in identifying risks to the program, but asked him, as a father, in direct and personal terms, to consider whether his continued presence in his daughter's professional life was good for either of them. Weston went to see him in person, which the old man had not expected. He sat across from a 70-year-old industrialist in a study full of framed certifications and said, without particular heat, that he had left once before because he had believed Vivienne wanted him gone. That belief had been given to him by someone else, and he had lived with its consequences for more than 2 decades, and he was not going to act on someone else's assessment of Vivienne Ashcroft's best interests a second time. Thaddeus was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that carried the particular weight of a man confronting something he had built without knowing its full dimensions, that he had only ever asked his lawyers to hold the correspondence for a season, to give Vivienne time to adjust before letting the summer romance resume, if it was going to. He had not given any instruction to fabricate anything, and he had lived with what he now understood had happened in that office, under the cover of his authority, as the most expensive mistake of a lifetime that had not been short on expensive mistakes. Marin Caldwell found Margaret Ellis through a pension filing from the dissolved Carrington Legal Partnership. Margaret was 74 years old, living in a retirement community 2 hours north of Lakehurst, and her first response to Marin's visit was to close the door. She had signed a confidentiality agreement at the time of the firm's dissolution and had spent 22 years arranging her memory of that summer into a shape she could live with. Marin told her, without embellishment, what Blaine was currently attempting to do with an aircraft that had non-conforming components installed in its flight control system. Margaret opened the door again and asked Marin to come in and sit down. She had never spoken to anyone about what she had seen in the files that season. She was going to speak about it now. Her account was precise in the way that accounts become precise when they have been reviewed privately for many years by someone who knows they are carrying a weight that may one day have to be set down. Thaddeus had instructed the firm to intercept and hold the correspondence, nothing more. A 3-month delay after which the letters would be forwarded and Vivienne could respond however she chose. Blaine, working as a summer associate and already demonstrating the particular ambition that would define his adult career, had gone further on his own initiative. He had held every letter from Weston. He had held every letter from Vivienne. He had composed 2 brief letters of termination, one in each voice, approximating each signature, and ensured they arrived at their destinations through a forwarding arrangement that bypassed the official hold. He had told Vivienne, when he visited London the following winter under the pretext of family business, that Weston had started seeing someone new. Margaret had seen the correspondence ledger. She had the entry numbers. 37 letters from Vivienne Ashcroft to Weston Hale, received and sequestered between June and the following August. 29 letters from Weston Hale to Vivienne Ashcroft, received and sequestered across the same window. All of them held in archive. None of them destroyed, because Blaine, even at 19, and perhaps especially at 19, had understood that physical documents were leverage. The same storage boxes that held the letters, transferred to a commercial archive facility when Carrington Legal dissolved, were located through the firm's final inventory records. They had never been formally requested for destruction because no one with standing to request it had known they existed. Inside, among the sealed envelopes, was a more recent document, a memorandum of understanding between Blaine Carrington and a shell entity registered in Delaware, whose beneficial ownership traced, after 3 holding layers, to Preston Lockwood's family office. The memorandum described a transaction structure, a timeline, and a set of performance conditions that together constituted the most legally precise definition of a conspiracy to commit corporate fraud that Marin had seen in 15 years of compliance work. The same document that proved Blaine had stolen 2 decades from 2 people also proved he had intended to steal the company. Weston and Vivian were shown the letters that evening. They sat across from each other at the long table in the airport conference room, the archive box between them, and neither of them reached for the envelopes. They understood without discussing it that the letters belonged to 2 young people who had loved each other with the uncomplicated certainty available. Only before life had taught them what certainty actually costs, and that those 2 people deserved to remain intact inside their sealed envelopes, unrevised by the knowledge of everything that had come after. Blaine moved first, because he had always preferred offense to the alternative. The morning before the board was scheduled to hear Marin's compliance findings, an Ashcroft security officer found a non-conforming component inside Weston's locked tool cabinet, bearing the same serial number family as the parts that had been installed in the Aurelian X during the sabotage window. Blaine presented this discovery to the board chair by telephone before 7 in the morning, framing it as confirmation that Weston had manufactured the technical crisis from the beginning, inserting faults to demonstrate diagnostic brilliance, engineering his way into the program, and using proximity to the CEO to position himself for outcomes that had nothing to do with aircraft safety. It was a complete narrative, internally consistent, and constructed with the kind of craft that requires having prepared it well before the circumstances that would make it necessary. Weston was escorted from the facility. He cooperated at every step. He had asked, as a condition of his cooperation, that continuous video documentation be maintained of the entire process, and the security team complied because the request was reasonable and because Marin Caldwell, who had happened to arrive at the facility at the same time, confirmed in writing that she was observing on behalf of the compliance office. On the short drive home, he called June and told her only that there would be some coverage of his name in the news, and that none of it reflected anything he needed to be ashamed of. June said she knew, and asked if he needed her to come get him, and he said he was fine, he was driving himself, and she should go to school. The security access log for the cabinet showed it had been opened with a management tier credential 2 days earlier, during a period when Weston was in a documented technical review session with Tobias and 4 members of the engineering team, all of whom had signed in and out on camera. The corridor camera covering the tool bay had experienced an 11-minute outage during that window, a scheduled maintenance pause, according to the submitted work order, except that no maintenance had been performed on that camera system in the preceding quarter, and the outage corresponded exactly with elevator records, showing that Blaine's personal assistant had descended to the technical floor and returned 12 minutes later. Weston reviewed the available data from his suspension and told Tobias that Blaine was accelerating, which meant the demonstration flight window was critical to the scheme in a way that had not been fully understood. If the Aurelian X flew with the current component configuration, it would produce exactly the class of visible, documentable failure that would justify the board accepting a distress-priced acquisition offer. Vivian suspended the flight. The board was angry. Lockwood Meridian's representatives withdrew from the room, and Blaine Carrington filed a motion for a vote of no confidence in the CEO. The board convened in the Ashcroft headquarters main conference room, and Blaine structured his presentation with the theatrical confidence of a man who believed he was delivering a verdict rather than making an argument. He laid out the accumulation, the phone, the contract, the component found in Weston's cabinet, the flight cancellations, and he returned to it deliberately, knowing its power, the lock-screen photograph of a 17-year-old boy that a 40-year-old chief executive had been carrying for reasons she had never disclosed to her governance structure. He suggested that the board was entitled to draw its own conclusions about the quality of judgment that produced that series of decisions. Vivian responded to the photograph directly. She said a personal image on a private device was not a governance matter, that it did not demonstrate professional incapacity, and that anyone who wished to argue otherwise was welcome to articulate the specific policy it violated. She was not going to pretend the photograph did not exist, and she was not going to explain herself to a room full of people who had never once asked Blaine Carrington to explain the decisions he had made on behalf of this company. Marin presented the security audit. The phone had not been unlocked. The access log showed the cabinet breach during Weston's verified absence. The camera outage aligned with the elevator record. Tobias followed with the engineering data, presenting in his precise and unhurried manner the complete fault analysis, the component substitution timeline, and the correlation between each substitution and a report routing through Blaine's office. He noted that every technical cue Weston had raised had been validated by subsequent testing, and that the one instance in which those cues had been dismissed, the initial return to service authorization, had been the closest the program had come to an in-flight failure. Margaret Ellis testified by video, her statement formally introduced by Marin as part of the compliance record. She described what she had seen in the Carrington legal office during that summer, the correspondence ledger, the sequential entries, the letters that had arrived and been held, the 2 documents that had gone out carrying signatures that were not genuine. Thaddeus Ashcroft, seated at the far end of the table as a non-voting former chairman, confirmed that his instruction had extended only to a temporary hold on communications, and that no fabrication had been authorized by him at any point. He said this clearly and without hedging, because he had spent enough time in the 2 weeks prior reconstructing what his decision to treat his daughter's happiness as a problem to be managed had actually produced, and he had concluded that the only useful thing left to him was accuracy. Weston presented last. He walked through the component serial number chain, the procurement authorization trail, the supply chain timing, and the memorandum of understanding recovered from the Carrington archive. He did not narrate the personal dimension of the investigation. He presented it as a technical and legal record, because that was what it was, and because the personal dimension had already been understood by everyone in the room long before he arrived. When Blaine said the signature on the memorandum was not his, Vivian produced the original document from the archive box, placed it on the table, and noted that it had been recovered with an intact notarial seal, a date stamp, and a full fingerprint set that the forensic unit had matched earlier that morning. The board vote was not close. Blaine was suspended from all executive functions pending a formal investigation by the company's external counsel, and, within 2 weeks, by federal aviation safety regulators who had been notified of the component substitution scheme. Preston Lockwood's acquisition approach was terminated. His proposed transaction structure referred to the relevant regulatory bodies, and the shareholders of Lockwood Meridian were not pleased with what they subsequently read in the investigative disclosures. Vivian retained her position and accepted a voluntarily initiated independent audit of the entire supply chain, not because she was required to, but because she understood that the people who built and serviced the aircraft her company produced deserved to know that the systems protecting them were sound. Thaddeus resigned his honorary chairmanship in a letter that was brief, private, and addressed to his daughter rather than to the board. He acknowledged that his belief in the correctness of his judgment had been the condition under which someone else's malice had operated, and that this was not a responsibility that could be shared or deferred. Vivian read it once, filed it, and did not respond for 3 weeks, at which point she called him, and they had a conversation that was not resolved by the end of the first hour, but that had not been possible before this. Weston was formally cleared and received a written offer from the company's board for the position of Director of Aviation Safety. He declined it. He explained, through Tobias, that accepting a position that placed him inside the Ashcroft executive structure would compromise both the independence of his work and the clarity of every other relationship in the building, and that he had spent enough of his adult life operating in circumstances where the personal and professional dimensions of a situation had been deliberately confused by people with an interest in the confusion. What he proposed instead was a partnership arrangement. He and Tobias would establish an independent airworthiness verification unit, incorporated separately, contracted at market rate to multiple commercial aviation clients, with Ashcroft Aeronautics as one client among several. The proposal was accepted. The unit took its first 2 contracts in the same quarter. Weston told June about the new arrangement on a Sunday morning over coffee, and she listened and then asked whether this was going to mean he traveled more or less than before. He said probably about the same. She said that was fine, and then she asked, with the careful, indirect precision of a 16-year-old who has already formed an opinion and would like her parent to catch up, whether Vivienne was going to be involved in the business. He said that they were separate arrangements. June said she understood that and asked again whether Vivienne was going to be involved. Weston told her they were figuring some things out. June said that seemed like a reasonable approach to most things. The months that followed moved at the pace of 2 people who had learned not to hurry conclusions. They saw each other when the work brought them to the same location, which was often enough. They had a series of dinners that were not announced as anything in particular, but that both of them showed up to having thought carefully about what they wanted to say. They were navigating the difference between the people they had been in love with at 17 and the people they were now, and they found that the navigating itself was something they were both genuinely interested in, which was its own kind of answer. The Aurelian X completed its final certification flight 14 months after the night Weston had found the phone on the hangar floor, with a fully re-audited component inventory and a monitoring protocol that Tobias had described in testimony to the regulatory body as the most rigorous supply chain verification process in the domestic commercial aviation sector. The airframe performed without anomaly across the full certification envelope. Weston was not aboard, because his role was in the analysis that preceded and followed flight, not in the flight itself. But he watched the telemetry feed from the ground station at Lakehurst with the particular attention of someone for whom this outcome had not been hypothetical. June graduated from Lakehurst High on a warm June evening, under the same sky that had covered the science fair where her father had built something he was proud of and stood beside someone he had not yet understood he was going to lose. Vivian attended the ceremony and sat next to Weston in the second row of the general seating, not in the reserved section, not as a distinguished guest or a donor to the school foundation, but as someone who was there because she wanted to be, for reasons that were entirely personal. June walked across the stage and found her father's face in the crowd and smiled the specific smile of a person who is satisfied with how things have turned out. After the ceremony, they went together, Weston, Vivienne, and June, back to the old municipal hangar where the original glider had been stored after its return from the state competition. The model had been professionally restored some years earlier as part of a local aviation history project and hung suspended from the ceiling on two thin cables, silver laminate wings precisely as they had been, the balance rig still visible beneath the fuselage. Weston had arranged to have the original full photograph mounted and framed on the wall beneath it. Both of them, unedited, standing together with the whole future apparently ahead of them. Vivienne handed him her phone. The lock screen had been changed. The image of the 17-year-old boy in the school jacket was gone. In its place was a photograph taken in the hangar on the morning of the Aurelian X's certification flight. Weston on the left, Vivienne on the right, June between them, all three looking at something outside the frame, and all three of them laughing at whatever it was. He looked at it for a moment and then asked whether replacing the old photograph meant she had decided to let go of the past. She said no. She had kept the original in a separate folder because it belonged to a version of herself she still wanted to be able to find. She had changed the lock screen because she no longer needed an old memory as a placeholder for someone she had actually found in the present. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope he had been carrying for a week. It was the last unsent letter from the archive box, one he had written in the November of the year Vivienne had left, addressed to a London address he had never confirmed, stamped but never mailed, and kept all these decades inside the sealed correspondence record because it had been intercepted before he could change his mind about sending it. He had read it once after receiving it back from the archive, then resealed it. The final sentence, legible through the envelope's worn translucency when held up to light, read, "If we ever find each other again, I hope I still have the courage to ask you one more time." Vivienne looked at the envelope and asked what he had wanted to ask. He did not produce a ring. He did not make a declaration that covered the distance of 22 years in a single sentence. He asked her to come home for dinner, to the house in Lakehurst, to the kitchen table where June did her homework, and the window faced the back garden, to an evening with no particular occasion that he would very much like her to be part of. He said this not with the urgency of someone trying to recover time, but with the steadiness of someone who had decided that the next chapter was worth beginning carefully. Vivienne said yes. The three of them walked out of the hangar together into the early summer night, and behind them the old glider turned slowly on its cables in the slight movement of the air from the opening door. No longer a monument to what had been taken, but evidence of the simpler, more durable truth that some journeys are not abandoned when they are interrupted. They are only waiting for the people who made them to find their way back to the beginning.